Hello. Thank you so much to the Capitol Historical Society for having me here today to commemorate the 100-year anniversary of Native American citizenship. My name is Elizabeth Hidalgo Reese Yunpoví, and I'm a citizen of Nambe Pueblo, a small tribe just north of Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I'm also a professor at Stanford Law School. I'm here to talk to you today about the complex legacy of American citizenship for Native peoples. I don't think that we adequately appreciate what a strange thing American civic participation, let alone American patriotism, is for Native people. We are, indeed, the colonized people of the United States, the recipients of this nation's colonial violence. The United States is the nation state that took absolute sovereignty and dominion of these lands away from our own tribal nations. If you think about it, every monument of American governance is also a memorial for the nations, the power, the world, and the lives that Native people do not have because of America. Look around you and notice that everything in America today exists because something else, a version of history where Native nations ruled these lands, does not exist. But this history that we do have and this reality is a complicated thing for Native peoples. And we have, unsurprisingly, complicated relationships with America and with American political power. This is not only because of the inherent tension between the existence of America instead of the absolute sovereignty of tribal nations, but also because of the way that American colonialism has played out. What I'm going to focus on today is just that, an aspect of American colonialism that has cast a particularly long shadow over the Native experience when it comes to movements for political power, even today in the 21st century. This includes both efforts to keep Native people from American citizenship or from utilizing its privileges, most notably, of course, the right to vote. But it also includes effort to use American citizenship or other forms of American political power as a tool for dismantling tribal governments and erasing Native cultures. This double-edged history that Native people have with political power and American citizenship is part of this legacy of what I call in a recent article I've published in the Stanford Law Review, assimilative colonialism. There are, to this day, aspects of the Native experience with political power that simply do not make sense unless we fully appreciate and reckon with the assimilative colonialism, with assimilative colonialism and its legacy on Native people's relationship with political power, and its legacy as having shaped the development of our government institutions. For example, I'm going to start by laying out a status quo picture. There are 574 federally recognized domestic dependent tribal nations in the United States. Each tribe is a separate political entity from the surrounding states, and it's self-governing. And yet, not even one of these 574 tribal governments sends a delegate or a representative to the US Congress. Instead, our democratic representative system is structured and draws its election boundaries as if tribal governments and the reservations that they live on did not exist. Tribal citizens are treated as if they were just like any other state citizen. But tribal citizens do not simply live within a state, and they are not governed by state law, just like any other state citizen. For many tribal citizens living on the reservation, it is tribal law, not state law, and tribal governments, not state governments, that primarily rules and shapes their lives. And so, why is it that tribes do not control their own democratic destinies? Even worse, why do we ask tribes to trust the states to structure democratic representation for them at the federal level? Indeed, it is the state legislatures who, by and large, draw district boundaries, and it is the states that determine the time, place, and manner of federal elections. A colleague at Arizona State is doing work on this and estimates that about 201 tribes are split by either state or county boundaries, some even multiple times. Tribal governments are not complementary or subsidiary governments to states. They are most often rivals for power and for resources. States and tribes that exist right next to each other are often described as the deadliest enemies, as the Supreme Court once put it. And while we often think of the many ways that the federal government has wronged Native people, the states often have an even worse reputation amongst Native people. The existing research we have on this suggests that tribal citizens trust their tribal governments the most, then the federal government, and then the states and local governments, the very least, often by large margins. This sentiment also correlates with what tribal voters say about their likelihood to participate in each one of these sovereigns' different elections. It's also a bit of a mystery why some states should trust tribal citizens who live and work on Indian lands to vote in state elections, when they may not have to live with the consequences, since state law does not, by and large, apply to tribal citizens who live on their reservations. So now that I've walked you through this status quo, I hope that you'd agree with me that there's a lot about this system that, simply put, doesn't make sense. There's a democratic mismatch between the reality of the governments that we have and the representative democratic structure that we built into the Constitution. Native nations have made do, certainly, with being excluded from the structure of representative democracy. We've built up an incredible infrastructure. Some tribes have fought for ambassador-like delegates, and importantly, many tribes have learned to function like highly effective lobbying organizations at both the tribal and pan-tribal levels. But the thing is, again, returning to my status quo conversation, they really shouldn't have to. Tribes aren't foreign nations anymore, and we also aren't private organizations. Tribes are governments. So why don't they have representation? Why haven't we built tribes into the democratic structures of the constitutional order? I often use this very technical and fancy phrase with my students when we get to describing these moments of inexplicable status quo situations in Indian affairs. I describe this as the clearly nobody planned for this system. And there's a real truth to that. Throughout American history, to put it bluntly, the long-term plan for tribal nations was that there was no long-term plan. We wouldn't need a long-term plan because the plan was that they would not survive. It was expected that tribal nations would disappear because their citizens would eventually, either by choice or by force, assimilate into the dominant American society and abandon their previous governments. The fact that tribal nations defied those expectations and did survive is what's created this conundrum. We planned to have a system of representative democracy built using just one kind of brick, the states. And yet, we have also now the tribes. What to do? I think it's high time we reconsider this democratic mismatch and the way that tribal nations and their voices and interests fit within our democracy. Tribes should have their own representation in the federal government. Honestly, why not? Why does this sound radical or crazy? One of the reasons, I think, or I argue as an academic, is that it is so hard to imagine tribal representation, again, because of the history and the legacy of what I call assimilative colonialism in America's history with tribal nations. That is, we can only imagine offering Native nations power if they are willing to effectively conform to the existing structures and cultures of American governance. Indeed, there have been attempts at tribal representation before. I've been researching them a fair amount. And in doing this research, I expected that the story would be a lot about race and colonialism. What I did not expect is that it would be a story so deeply intertwined with questions about statehood and the structure of institutions. These states are based on a set of powers that the Constitution gives them, incredibly well positioned to exercise a effectively gatekeeping function over who else can become a state or amass political power. States have also made incredible use of this privileged power of statehood. They've used the unique power of controlling the units of representative government to win at the federal level, and their place within the Constitution to even further entrench the relative power of states through legal doctrine. We are, I think, familiar with thinking of states as institutions that are capable of using the power of government to suppress or oppress their own people, often minority groups. Indeed, much of the civil rights era legislation recognizes just that and targets specifically the states as potential bad actors. But we are not as used to thinking about states as capable of suppressing and oppressing rival governments or threats to their own power. But this has indeed happened a great deal in the history of Native nations. And this happened in a variety of ways. What I found is a fairly ugly history of white majorities in states exercising a gatekeeping function over who else can send delegates can send delegates to become a state or amass enough political power to control a state. First, there are the native states that never were. There is the promised but never delivered potential of an Indian state in the treaty with the Delawares, and the failed attempts of the 5 tribes in what was then called the Indian Territory to establish a separate state called the state of Sequoia, instead of being combined with the western part of the state to become what is now Oklahoma. Some states were also denied statehood status in largely native areas until they assimilated or white citizens became the majority, demonstrating a fear of native political power in these areas. California and New Mexico are an indicative contrast, since they shared Mexican origins and annexation in the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Despite initial skepticism about their statehood, the gold rush ensured that California quickly had enough white citizens to alleviate Congress's concerns and was then swiftly admitted as a state in 1850. While New Mexico was denied statehood for decades due to fear in Congress that they were not yet white or American enough. Then there are the tribal delegates. There are the delegates which were promised but never delivered, like the Cherokee delegate in the Treaty of New Echota. And there are the delegates that are largely powerless, like the tribal delegates that Maine has within its state legislature, that got so fed up with their lack of any real power within the system and the terrible relations that they had within the state that they stopped sending representatives at all during very important conflicts. There are also attempts by white majorities to hold on to political power within states, which has also led to denials of Native people's individual rights. The 14th Amendment didn't extend birthright citizenship to Native people. And it is quite clear from the congressional debates that there was a lot of fear about doing so. There was not only racist rhetoric that undermined the worthiness of Native people for citizenship, but a clear fear that if Native people became citizens, the Western states would be overrun, and Native people could control the elections in these states. Thus, in a lot of the Western states, the existing state governments, including Supreme Courts, kept Native people from voting or being considered citizens of the states on a variety of theories, and in some instances for decades. Ultimately, Native people didn't gain citizenship until, of course, the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. However, before then, Indians could not be American citizens until they had destroyed what had made them Indians in the first place. There were numerous treaties which offered citizenship to Indians, but only those Indians who adopted quote-unquote civilized customs or otherwise gave up their collective land holdings and Indian ways of life. I am not speaking in hyperbole here. There were formal processes the government set up, whether through legislation or treaty, for Native people to gain citizenship conditioned on assimilation, at times being asked to swear an oath to give up their native ways of life and instead pledge loyalty to the United States. And policies such as Indian boarding schools that were focused on the eradication of Native identity and culture for children were also understood by those who designed them as political violence, as an attempt to destroy the future citizens of tribal nations and to sever their loyalty to their tribes and replace it with instead loyalty to the Stars and Stripes. What's going on here? Yes, it's a lot of state gatekeeping, white majorities trying to hold on to political power, and acts of explicit violence against tribal identities. But it's also a more nefarious dynamic with lasting implications for how we think about reform and Native efforts to gain political power in the 21st century. Unfortunately, I think this history has not only shaped our existing democratic structures, the states and representatives that we have and do not have, but it's had a lasting effect on Native American relationships with American political power. Because you see, the nefarious brilliance of much of this history was to offer American political power to Native peoples, whether citizenship, statehood, or delegates, only and always at the cost of what made them Indians. This move, which I call assimilative colonialism, positioned American political power and Indianness as if they were inherently incompatible with one another. And as a result, many Native peoples justifiably view American political power not as empowering, but as dangerous. When things like birthright citizenship in the Indian Citizenship Act came to Native peoples, it was not met with universal joy, but with skepticism or resistance by some. Some tribes wrote to Washington pleading against the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act. Think about that. After centuries of oppression and violence, the nation that has done you wrong offers a potential avenue for exercising and amassing political power within itself, and many Native peoples viewed it as inherently suspect, as dangerous. Assimilative colonialism has made it previously impossible to even imagine tribal political power or representation in a real sense. Because every time it was offered, it was a Trojan horse. I do not mean to dismiss the legitimate concerns that Native people and tribal governments have about participating in the American institutions or being absorbed by them. Quite the opposite. I want to lay out that Native people have very good reasons to feel this way, reasons justified by a mountain of historical evidence. However, it didn't have to be this way, and it doesn't need to be this way going forward. This fear of political participation is due, at least in part, to the United States government's own policies and is a product of assimilative colonialism in its own right. So to do it any differently now, I think we have to recognize and reckon with our history of assimilative colonialism and to intentionally depart from it. The 574 tribal governments are part of the American family of governments. They ought to have some kind of seat at the table. The mistake of assimilative colonialism has been to insist that tribes always conform and reform themselves to be more like or to fit within the systems of the United States, rather than realizing that the United States might need to be itself more flexible in order to embrace its tribal nations. So rather than force more change on them, I think we ought to listen to Indian tribes about what kind of representation they might actually want. Would they want to be states? Some might. Others might find the bundle of rights, powers, and limitations that come with statehood a poor fit for their sovereign nation. Others might want something else. New Zealand does something that I find really fascinating. Their Maori citizens choose whether or not they want to be on the general electoral roll or the Maori roll, and then seats are apportioned to each roll based on the population of each. This ensures separate Maori representation, but only for those citizens who opt into it. I think it is long overdue that we step back and examine the legacy of assimilative colonialism on American representative democracy. It has, in my view, sowed powerful and destructive distrust, while also serving as a confining force on our imagination of what is possible. In the 21st century, I think we ought to think about structural reform and what representative structures could and maybe should have been created if tribal governments and their citizens were, since the beginning, included. If we actually had planned for it, planned for them to survive and be a real and integrated part of the structure of American governance. What representative structures can we imagine for American citizens who are also tribal citizens? Can we imagine one that might actually, well, better represent them? Thank you all so much for your time. And I, again, am so sorry that I could not be there in person.